Now, one day, and he said, Ernie, we've known each other forever. He said, how come we never worked together? And I said, that's because you're afraid to work with good actors.
He was Hollywood's unlikely hero, an Oscar winner with a grin as wide as his temper. Ernest Borgnine built a career on toughness, but off-camera, his words could cut deeper than any role he ever played. Friends remembered him as loyal and generous, yet there was one man who brought out the side of Borgnine that few dared to cross.
Frank Sinatra. You know, a lot of people used to say bad things about him. Oh, he's a drunk, or, you know, he likes to fight and everything.
It wasn't a petty rivalry or a fleeting spat. It was personal, raw, and lasting. Who could provoke such lasting anger in a man loved by millions? The answer may surprise you. From sailor to star, before Ernest Borgnine ever stepped in front of a camera, before the gap-toothed grin became famous, he was just Hermes Ephron Borgnino from Hamden, Connecticut. Born to Italian immigrants, Borgnine grew up in a household defined by struggle, discipline, and survival. His parents' marriage faltered when he was still a boy, and his mother briefly took him to Italy, where he absorbed both the beauty and hardship of his heritage. By the time they returned to the United States, Ernest already carried a dual sense of identity. Half American grit, half European resilience, that would shape how he lived and how he acted. School never lit his fire, and like so many Depression-era kids, he craved direction more than academics. At 18, he found it in the Navy. Enlisting in 1935, Borgnine stepped into a world of order, duty, and camaraderie that would mold him for the rest of his life. He served for a decade, and when World War II broke out, he didn't shy away. Stationed on destroyers patrolling dangerous waters, he experienced combat, routine drudgery, and the kind of brotherhood that only war can forge. Later in life, he often said those Navy years gave him everything: discipline, toughness, and loyalty. Long after he left the service, he still spoke at veterans' events, proud of wearing that uniform. When World War II was over, men were struggling to come back to their civil lives as they were before, and he was no exception. He had no plans, had undergone no special training, and did not have a clear idea about the things ahead. It was his mother who sowed in him the seed of an idea: acting. She told him he was naturally gifted in expression and should try it. It sounded absurd to him. He had no theater background, no connections in Hollywood, no pathway. Yet, he would have followed them, had Borgnine so ordered. Acting was his siren's call. He took classes and treated them like drills, showing up early, studying late, and grinding through the work. It was there that he had the making of the theater as much of his training ground. His formative years were spent at the Barter Theater in Virginia, where young actors were engaged to perform not for money, but for bread. And soon after, he marked out a reputation for himself as a man of character in Broadway productions. Polished? He wasn't. Glamorous? He wasn't. But above everything was the reality that was, at the end of the day, believable. In a profession that thrives upon artifice, that was the charm that set a script aside for him. Hollywood came calling, and Ernest Borgnine responded. Back in the 1950s, he would act in supporting roles in films such as From Here to Eternity, 1953, wherein his portrayal of the cruel Sergeant Fatso Judson caught the attention of the audience and critics alike. Already, he was being stereotyped as the brute, the one who. But then came the film that changed everything, Marty, 1955. Borgnine, playing a lonely butcher from the Bronx searching for love, shed his tough exterior and displayed tender, aching humanity. The opposite of all the menacing roles he had been given before. That part won him the Academy Award for Best Actor. The Oscar not only put a crown on his career, it turned it upside down. The tough guy on whom everyone could count was now a certified leading man who could carry a whole film on his shoulders. The jump from nameless sailor to award-winning actor was improbable, to say the least, and altogether inspirational. The tone of the rest of his life was set. Borgnine cared nothing for pretense. He valued hard work, loyalty, and honesty. The discipline he earned at sea and the grit he carried from the stage made him a chameleon on screen, exactly the kind of actor who could wear a dozen faces without losing himself. Career of many faces. After the unlikely triumph of Marty in 1955, Ernest Borgnine could have coasted on the success of his Oscar win. Many actors who hit those heights fall into the trap of repeating themselves, chasing safe roles that match their most famous performance. But Borgnine wasn't built for that. His career became a patchwork of contradictions, villains and heroes, comedy and tragedy, gritty war dramas, and family-friendly television. Few actors of his generation wore so many faces, and fewer still pulled them off with such conviction. In the years immediately following Marty, Hollywood tried to figure out what to do with him. He had the credibility of an Academy Award winner, but the look of a brawler. Studios cast him in films where they needed a physical presence with emotional depth. In The Catered Affair, 1956, he played a working-class father juggling the cost of his daughter's wedding against the weight of his own unfulfilled dreams. It was worlds away from his earlier roles as heavies, yet he made it work. Audiences believed him because he always carried pieces of his own life into the performance. By the 1960s, Borgnine had become the definition of versatility. He slipped into westerns with ease, carving a place in one of Hollywood's most dominant genres. In The Wild Bunch, 1969, he stood shoulder to shoulder with some of the era's toughest actors, his presence lending grit and gravity to Sam Peckinpah's bloody reinvention of the Western myth. He wasn't the swaggering cowboy, nor the romantic hero. He was the man who looked like he'd actually lived it, who carried the dust and scars in his face. The war film, by virtue of the theme and Atlantic presence, was a natural fit for Borgnine. He had the credibility of a Navy veteran ready to be trusted by audiences in uniform. In The Dirty Dozen, 1967, he played Major General Worden, the taciturn commander assembling a ragtag group of convicts for a perilous mission. It was his commanding authority that brought weight to the film, while his subtle humor kept it alive. It was these kinds of roles that Borgnine pulled off best, grounding larger-than-life tales with performances grounded in reality and never theatrical. Then came television, the medium that would bring Borgnine into millions of living rooms and cement his place in pop culture. In 1962, he took on the role of Lieutenant Commander Quentin McHale in McHale's Navy. The show reversed his tough guy aura into a comic persona, leading a misfit crew of scheming sailors during World War II. Timing was everything, and his warmth was undeniable. Families that had never seen his darker or more dramatic work knew him now as the lovable rogue of primetime TV. This was demonstration enough for Borgnine to make any genre his own: film, television, drama, or comedy. Long before he became too old to hang up his acting boots, Borgnine pushed back against being boxed in, appearing in action-soaked adventures throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and then accepting smaller dramas, offbeat projects, and all that would fall outside strict categories. He was a commander of a submarine in Ice Station Zebra, 1968, a grizzled survivor in Escape from New York, 1981, and played numerous other roles associated with difficult definitions. All these performances bore the signature of Borgnine, the toughness and humor, and a baffling touch of vulnerability. And then, In the late 1990s and early 2000s, he did the impossible. That is, something not done by many of his contemporaries. He found himself signing for a second life with the younger audience. Mermaid Man's voice in SpongeBob SquarePants was thus Borgnine's introduction to kids too young to remember him as an Oscar winner. His boisterous and comical pitch gave the character a cult following, proving, once again, that Borgnine knew how to reinvent himself for each generation. That fearless range won him audiences and adversaries because refusing to play the Hollywood game can cost you peace at home and harmony on set. Turbulent loves, colorful life. If Ernest Borgnine's career was marked by versatility, his personal life was defined by turbulence. Behind the hearty laugh and approachable charm was a man searching again and again for stability in love, only to find himself caught in storms of passion, conflict, and reinvention. Over his lifetime, Borgnine married 5 times. Each relationship told a different story, some warm, some disastrous, and one that finally gave him peace. His first marriage came in 1949, just as he was leaving the Navy and had not yet found his footing as an actor. He wed Rhoda Kemmons, a woman who stood by him during that uncertain transition from sailor to civilian. Together, they had a daughter, Nancy, born in 1952. For nearly a decade, Borgnine juggled family life with the demands of an emerging acting career, but Hollywood often pulled him in directions no marriage could survive. By 1958, the union collapsed, leaving him a divorced father just as fame began to call. Not long after, Borgnine entered a whirlwind romance with Mexican actress Katy Jurado. Jurado was already celebrated for her fiery performances in both Hollywood and Mexican cinema, and their marriage in 1959 was as passionate as it was volatile. Both were strong-willed, fiercely independent, and deeply tied to their careers. Their clashes were constant, and though Borgnine admired Jurado's strength, the marriage lasted only 4 years. In 1963, they parted ways. Later, Borgnine spoke of her with respect, acknowledging that their intensity made coexistence impossible. Then came the short but infamous marriage that, above all others, had adorned the life of Borgnine. In 1964, he wed Broadway legend Ethel Merman. On paper, it seemed like a power hit of 2 strong personalities, but, in fact, it was a disaster from the very start. The marriage was destined to end in 42 days, making it one of the shortest, most talked-about unions in Hollywood. Merman later made her feelings abundantly clear in her autobiography by leaving an entire page blank that was supposed to contain her thoughts on her marriage to Borgnine. Friends called it an accident waiting to happen. 2 explosives in one room. Looking for more stability, Borgnine 1965 married Donna Rancourt. With her, he had 3 more children, Sharon, Christopher, and Diana. This marriage lasted 7 years, the longest duration so far. Borgnine relished being a father, always talking about the joy his children brought him. But again, the pressures of his busy career and the strains of Hollywood life took their toll on the marriage, and by 1972, it ended too. A year hence, the woman discovered Borgnine as his destiny to shape all aspects of his life. In 1973, he tied the knot with Norwegian-born businesswoman Tove Tresnæs, who later built a successful cosmetics empire under the name of Tove Borgnine. Unlike previous marriages, which were fiery and tumultuous, this one provided the stability and companionship he had longed for. It was a moment he had waited for. Tove, thus, was usually his anchor over the years, nearly 4 decades, as he lived life with his spouse. Stood by him through the crescendos and decrescendos of his later career, she remained until he breathed his last in 2012. In total, the Marriages of Borgnine narrated the story of a person insatiably queuing for taste inside the love domain, only to collide on most occasions with it. His charm and life force could be captivating, but very often, too much. He wasn't the easiest of people to live with, and he would admit as much to himself. And still, the turbulence that defined his marriages found a parallel in another corner of his life: his unfiltered honesty about the colleagues he worked with, a candor that earned him both deep friendships and bitter enemies. Borgnine's Hollywood loves and hates. Ernest Borgnine's career was as much about the people he encountered as the roles he played. In a town famous for its polite silences and whispered resentments, Borgnine's willingness to speak his mind set him apart. He had a knack for forming powerful bonds with those he admired, but he was equally open about calling out arrogance when he saw it. That duality, embracing some, rejecting others, became part of his reputation, a reflection of a man who valued authenticity over diplomacy. On the side of admiration, Borgnine's affection for certain colleagues never wavered. He considered Spencer Tracy the ultimate professional, praising his generosity both on and off the set. To Borgnine, Tracy embodied the very essence of what an actor should be: disciplined, humble, and dedicated to the story above personal vanity. Bette Davis earned similar respect. Known for her commanding presence, Davis could have been intimidating, but Borgnine admired her directness and tireless work ethic. In his eyes, she was not only formidable on screen, but also fair and supportive in the trenches of filmmaking. Among his closest companions was Tim Conway, his partner in comedy on McHale's Navy. Their friendship was rooted in genuine laughter and mutual respect. Borgnine adored Conway's kindness and unassuming nature, noting how he treated everyone, from co-stars to crew members, with warmth. This relationship illustrated the best of Hollywood for Borgnine: camaraderie, loyalty, and the joy of collaboration. At the same time, Borgnine had little patience for those who embodied the opposite. He was outspoken about his dislike of arrogance, entitlement, or half-hearted effort. While he never sought conflict for its own sake, he saw no reason to hide his opinions. If someone disrespected a crew member or dismissed a fellow actor, Borgnine noticed, and often remembered. To him, filmmaking was a team sport, and anyone who ignored that truth lost his admiration instantly. His blunt honesty startled others from time to time. Rarely in an industry where a career could be jeopardized by keeping the peace have we seen a refusal to play politics. Borgnine would openly indicate when he disliked working with someone, but would equally compliment those he held in esteem. This balance in his comments allowed him to appear credible, even noble, rather than seeking revenge. Borgnine's honesty was interesting because of the contrast it afforded. He could be the most congenial presence on set, swapping stories with grips and extras alike, or the most caustic critic if someone had overstepped their bounds. Loyalty was praised. He could not abide condescension. Work was admired. Laziness drew his scorn. These were all extremes, emanating from a code he had carried since his Navy days. Respect everybody, do the work, and don't act like you're better than anyone else. In time, this honesty became his legend. Hollywood is filled with performers who avoid controversy by speaking in generalities. Borgnine's candor stood in stark contrast. It was admired by fans, respected by colleagues, and grudgingly lived with by those who criticized him. Good or bad, he said it while other people were just whispering about it. For Borgnine, Hollywood was not about movies, but about people. Some were cherished by him, others were rejected, but he would never pretend. Praise and criticism rolled off his tongue with equal force, but one name in particular seemed to ignite his disdain more than any other. A figure who embodied everything Borgnine could not stand. Why Sinatra was the worst. When Ernest Borgnine was asked late in life if there were any actors he truly hated, he didn't hesitate. He laughed, then gave the same name he had repeated for decades: Frank Sinatra. In a career that spanned more than 60 years and crossed paths with hundreds of performers, Sinatra alone stood out as the figure Borgnine simply could not abide. Their tension wasn't about competing for roles or Hollywood gossip. At its core, it was about values, and Borgnine believed Sinatra embodied the worst traits show business could produce. Their paths first crossed in the 1950s, when Sinatra was reinventing himself from crooner to dramatic actor. Films like From Here to Eternity proved he could succeed on screen, and critics began to take him seriously. Audiences saw a star transformed, but Borgnine wasn't impressed. Having clawed his way up through theater troupes, bit parts, and years of military service, Borgnine recognized shortcuts when he saw them. To him, Sinatra's rise looked less like hard work and more like a celebrity opening doors others had to batter down through persistence. What cemented Borgnine's animosity was Sinatra's behavior on set. He recalled repeatedly how Sinatra carried himself with superiority, dismissing character actors and talking down to crews. Borgnine believed every job mattered, from the star to the technician setting lights. That conviction came from the Navy, where survival depended on respecting each sailor's role. Watching Sinatra treat others as disposable clashed with everything Borgnine valued. He thought he was better than everyone else, Borgnine had once said, and I couldn't stomach it. Unlike other grudges that faded with time, this one only sharpened. Even decades later, Borgnine refused to soften his stance. He admitted disagreements with other actors might stem from misunderstandings or personality clashes, but not with Sinatra. In his eyes, arrogance wasn't a quirk. It was a flaw of character. That certainty gave his words unusual weight, turning them from personal dislike into moral opposition. Such abhorrence extended to the dislike of the cultures surrounding Sinatra. The Rat Pack, so full of its swaggering exclusivity, something that connoted Hollywood elite treating stardom like some entitlement, had at its center the king of that court, flanked by Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop. That world felt toxic to someone like Borgnine, who, even after his Oscar, saw himself as a working man. It was a childhood marked by hardship, 10 years of wearing a uniform, and millions of fights with destiny to score every role in life. Sinatra's defenders often point out his fidelity to friends or personal munificence, but Borgnine never saw that side. Their psyches contradicted each other too much. While Sinatra portrayed himself as a celebrity through his charm and mystique, Borgnine openly rated people on bluntness and authenticity. While Sinatra thrived in elite circles, Borgnine gravitated toward ordinary men, who reminded him of his roots. Therefore, it was destined that they would rub against each other like sandpaper. But, for Borgnine, it seemed there were never any regrets about speaking his mind, even at the end of his life. Asked to comment one last time on Sinatra, he outright dismissed any possibility of reconciliation. Tempers, eccentricities, and even broken friendships could all be forgiven, but arrogance was another matter. It, to him, just tainted the work and showed great disrespect to the art itself. Arrogance was what Sinatra was all about, and in Borgnine's world, that made him the worst colleague he had to work with. One could say this feud became an ornament in Borgnine's legend, not because it was small-minded, but because it stood for his big-minded ideas. He would not tolerate arrogance. Respect was the most cherished ethic for all whom he esteemed, and no way would stardom ever excuse bad behavior in his presence.
Sinatra may have represented the pinnacle of arrogance in Borgnine's eyes, but he wasn't the only colleague to test his patience. Others, from icons to rising stars, revealed the same traits he refused to tolerate.
Other clashes and quiet grudges. Over a career spanning 6 decades, Ernest Borgnine worked with hundreds of performers. Many earned his admiration, but others tested his patience in quieter, thornier ways. Unlike his open disdain for Frank Sinatra, these tensions were more nuanced, part respect, part frustration. Yet they revealed just as much about Borgnine's values. One of the more surprising names to draw his criticism was John Wayne. On screen, Wayne embodied American masculinity, his swagger defining an era of westerns and war films. Borgnine respected that image, but off-screen, he found the Duke difficult. Working with Wayne, he said, felt like walking on eggshells. Wayne needed to dominate every room, whether on set or in conversation. He wasn't hostile, but his commanding presence left little space for collaboration, something Borgnine prized. The clash wasn't explosive, but it underscored a key difference. Wayne thrived on hierarchy, while Borgnine believed in teamwork.
Dean Martin posed a different kind of irritation. Unlike Wayne, Martin wasn't domineering. He was, in Borgnine's eyes, too indifferent. Martin coasted on charm, easy laughs, and his Rat Pack persona. For Borgnine, who prided himself on giving his all to every role, that nonchalance felt like a slight to the craft. He once dismissed Martin with a blunt line: he never took anything seriously, not even the work. Borgnine never hated Martin with Sinatra-level venom, but he couldn't respect someone who treated acting as an afterthought. Beyond these giants, Borgnine's frustration often extended to younger actors rising in the 1970s and 1980s. Many, he felt, came in entitled, armed with instant fame but lacking discipline. Having built his career the hard way, through theater, small parts, and rejection, he had little patience for those who skipped the grind. What particularly angered him was disrespect toward crews. Borgnine believed film crews were the backbone of every production. Seeing actors snap at grips or ignore technicians struck him as arrogance of the worst kind, a betrayal of the collaborative spirit that defined filmmaking. He was tested by television as well. His stardom was an award-winning show called McHale's Navy, but he was being blasted by certain co-stars who treated long-running shows more as playpens and not as jobs. He cringed at the fact that his co-stars would fail to rehearse, bungle their lines, and treat the set as if it were a vacation spot. Borgnine's own discipline, military and theater training, called for consistency. He expected the same seriousness on a television set as he did on a film shoot. And when others fell short, his frustration was clear. Borgnine, however, was never one to provide such critiques unilaterally. He could work with individuals he held grudges with without backbiting projects, and he was a good reporter who balanced the negatives with the positives. His disaffection with Wayne, for instance, could not lessen the measure of respect he had for Wayne's film legacy. In the same vein, disappointment in Martin did not rob one of Martin's magnetism. His frustrations with the younger generation of actors were more closely aligned with lament than hatred. Consistency tied all his grudges together. He didn't hate people mostly for their faults or tempers. He stood against arrogance, laziness, and disrespect, all in the same breath. They trespassed against the code he had carried ever since childhood and trained by the Navy: respect the work,
respect the people, and show up ready. In a business rife with ego and distraction, that little creed of his was simple and unyielding. Another string of arguments heated by that of his with Sinatra, but furnished a little more flesh and blood into the portrait of the man. He is certainly approachable, generous, and loved by many, but very uncompromising when it comes to his principles. John Wayne's big ego, Dean's indifferent attitude, and the entitlement shown by younger actors mainly rubbed him the wrong way. At the end of the day, he would hit out at everyone with the same bluntness and refusal to pretend. Taken together, these feuds showed the consistency of his principles. But to truly grasp Borgnine, you had to look past the conflicts and into the man himself, the code he lived by, and the authenticity that defined his legacy. The man behind the feuds. For all the talk of Ernest Borgnine's grudges and blunt opinions, it would be wrong to define him only by the names he disliked. The man behind those feuds was far more complex. A mix of contradictions shaped by hardship, discipline, humor, and a devotion to authenticity. To understand why he spoke so openly about Sinatra, Wayne, or Dean Martin, you have to look at the code he lived by, one forged in the Navy, tempered in poverty, and carried proudly into Hollywood. At his core, Borgnine was a worker. He wasn't born into privilege, nor did he view acting as glamorous. For him, it was a job, a craft to respect. You showed up on time, knew your lines, treated the crew well, and gave your best no matter the project. That blue-collar ethic, drilled into him at sea and on stage, left him impatient with arrogance or laziness. When he criticized Martin's casual style or Sinatra's ego, it wasn't jealousy. It was disappointing that others didn't honor the work the way he did. Yet, his bluntness also made him real. While many stars played politics to keep their careers safe, Borgnine had little interest in Hollywood games. He valued honesty over diplomacy. If he didn't like you, he said it. If he respected you, he said that too, loudly and often. Those who earned his trust described him as fiercely loyal, generous with advice, and protective of younger actors finding their way. The warmth of his personality often surprised those who only knew his on-screen image. He could play violent villains, tough soldiers, or desperate loners, yet in life he was approachable, quick to laugh, and famously down to earth. Fans told stories of meeting him on the street and being stunned by how open he was. No handlers, no aloofness, just Ernie, happy to shake hands and share a story. That openness extended to colleagues as well. For every feud, there were countless friendships rooted in humor and mutual support. His personal life included a similar blend of volatility and warmth. The 5 marriages of Borgnine showcased his passionate and tempestuous side, but his long-lasting marriage to Tova Triesneus proved his ability for devotion and commitment. He loved his children and often talked about family being a grounding force, even when work took him elsewhere. To his closest circle, he wasn't the gruff sailor or the Hollywood tough guy. He was someone who loved to laugh, good food, and surrounded himself with those he trusted. Well into his 80s and dying laughing, Borgnine was asked, "Are there any actors you really hate?" He chuckled, "Yes, sure, Sinatra." The laughter was very important. While he was never one to tolerate arrogance, he didn't carry bitterness like a permanent burden. His refreshing honesty when speaking of people always lacked malice. He hated behavior. He didn't hate people. He hated arrogance, not people. In the end, Borgnine's frank comments would also be part of his legend. Even so, they never overshadowed his work or reputation among one of the most relatable stars of Hollywood. He could win an Oscar while performing as a lonely butcher, then later entertained children as the voice of a goofy cartoon superhero. He crossed borderlines from gritty war dramas to those of light-hearted comedy, always bringing the same sincerity to bear on any role. That was the story behind Ernest Borgnine's strongest feud, and why it still fascinates Hollywood fans today. What do you think about his outspoken honesty? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Stick around and watch the next video showing on your screen. You won't want to miss it.